Great to meet you. As you mentioned, my name is Michael Bernstein. I'm presenting this, but it's really an effort that I want to highlight my collaborators, Margaret Levy, who's a professor of political science at Stanford and former director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, David Magnus, who runs the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Stanford, and Deborah Satz, who's an ethicist and also happens to be the Dean of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford. So this has really been all of us working together on this effort that we call the ESR, or Ethics and Society Review of AI research. Now, okay, if my first slide surprises you, then you've probably wandered into the wrong conference. The observation that there are risks and harms to AI it's a horse that's already left the barn. At this point, I guess my contention would be that that horse has crossed state lines, it's raced halfway across the continent, it's attracted international headlines, and it's landed a shoe company scholarship. AI results are implicated in generating and propagating disinformation, depressing wages for workers, perpetuating systemic inequality in policing and the justice system, advancing unequal healthcare outcomes. Pick your poison. We have to face these issues. And my topic today is around institutional responses, what we do at an institutional level to try to address it. And I think Deb gave a really fantastic talk on what has, in my view, been one of the most impactful interventions into the community at an institutional level, which has been the NeurIPS ethical review process. I want to focus on a complementary angle here, which is what happens when we get involved in the formative stages of research. And so there are lots of things that we can do. For example, opt-in approaches like office hours, but sometimes the people who really need this don't do it. And the efforts like at NeurIPS are really powerful, but sometimes people don't think about it early enough. I think Deb was pointing out how if only this were considered earlier in the research design, that we might be able to do further. And so as the conversation has happened, and I saw that Professor Fiesler mentioned, or was speaking earlier, you might think, well, okay, this should be the domain of the IRB. Like we often see these responses are like, how did this possibly get through the IRB? And as was mentioned, this is, at least in the United States, illegal. We're not allowed to do this in the IRB because the IRB regulations focus on risks to human subjects, not risks to human society. So if you want to go stare at the common rule, I've just bolded the relevant part here that the IRB is disallowed in the United States from considering long-range effects as among the risks that fall within its purview. What this means is that many of the graduate students and colleagues in my own department at Stanford could come up with a project, go find some data, train the model, evaluate it, publish it without ever even going through IRB training, not to mention going through IRB review. And that this is, and in fact, in the cases where they go to the IRB returns it and says, I'm sorry, we can't help you. They are not allowed to do this. Now, I do want to point out that not every IRB works this way. In particular, I want to highlight Mary Gray's work at Microsoft Research on the Microsoft Research Ethics Review Program, which is a registered IRB, but also taking a sort of more anthropological lens, views communities as participants in research. So they will consider this. But I will say that most universities like my own don't, and we want to try to raise the bar here. So what we've been doing at Stanford now for a couple of years is something that we call Ethics and Society Review, or ESR. It's an institutional process that we developed, and we've been collaborating with Stanford High, which is this Institute for Human-Centered AI Research, that basically is trying to facilitate researchers in mitigating these negative ethical and societal aspects of AI research. And I do want to highlight, I'm channeling my colleague Margaret Levy here and saying that there's both ethical and societal risks, and those are not always overlapping. The basic trick, as I would describe it, is that it's a gate to access funding, as the introduction spoke of, that essentially, just like I cannot spend money on a grant for human subjects research until the IRB is approved, here with the ESR, you do not get access to your grant funding until this ESR funding is completed for a project that you're looking to start. So just to sort of give you a sense of what happens, Stanford High runs a series of seed grants or other kinds of internal funding opportunities. People will submit their grants alongside a statement that sort of is asked to name the possible risks of the research they're proposing. And then you can't stop there. Critically, you have to articulate what principles you and other researchers in your field should use to mitigate those risks, and then demonstrate how you're planning to instantiate those principles in the research design. Now, we attempt to try to keep this as lightweight as possible. These statements are not typically that long. They're intended to be the start of the conversation, not the end of it. But you submit this alongside your grants. And then the funding program, in this case here, the seed grant program or else, is going to do their own typical review. So they're going to do their own merit review, decide what they want to fund. At which point they then send the stuff they want to fund to us, to this ESR panel. We have a series of participants in the ESR that might range from faculty, staff, and some graduate students and postdocs who are interested, do a first triage round. Many of the grants actually have no substantial ethical societal risks. For example, we're trying to organize a workshop to discuss societal risks. There's not a huge risk there. But then those that are seen to have something worth discussing essentially go to a full panel of faculty, which at least in our efforts thus far, the ESR panel has involved faculty across the university from anthropology, communication, engineering like CS, history, management science, medicine, philosophy. We sort of try to get a broad range and pair every grant that wants to be funded with someone who's coming from its methodological tradition alongside someone who's coming from a complementary methodological tradition. So if I, as an engineer, am submitting a grant, then it's going to get reviewed by someone who comes from an engineering tradition, and then someone who might come from like a humanities or social science tradition. Then the panel will give feedback. They will send us feedback saying, they'll raise new risks. They'll say, have you thought about this? Maybe you should adjust your mitigation strategies in the following way. And this will iterate back and forth with the PIs until the ESR panel is satisfied that there's an appropriate mitigation. Now, you can never completely mitigate, and as Deb mentioned, you can't always even foresee all of the things that might happen. What we want to try to do here is take more of the stuff from the unforeseen category into the foreseen category so that we can sort of design the research upfront to deal with it. And once this is done, essentially, we just pass our recommendation back along to the funding program, and the funds are released. So we do provide a bunch of scaffolding at this point, having done this a number of times now, to the researchers who are writing these ESR statements. You can see here one example category of risk around data representativeness, and a principle that such researchers might actually articulate, and a mitigation strategy in the context of the research that might work. So just to give you a sense, here's a project that would happen in the initial year of our efforts with the ESR. There was a collaboration between faculty in the School of Engineering and in medicine that were trying to do non-invasive stress sensing for workers in the office. They wanted to help build tools that would help workers de-stress. In the process, naming concerns that they might be building a surveillance state a little bit. But they just said, well, that's a risk, and stopped there. So the ESR panel feedback basically said, well, okay, what are you going to do about this? You can't just name the risk. And so this resulted in a bunch of, of some rounds of feedback. There was a meeting between some of the panelists and the PIs to discuss what they might be able to do. And eventually the solution that the teams came to as an appropriate mitigation for now would be to say, if you're going to do this, we need to basically engage a privacy preserving architecture. So everything's done on the worker's phone that they own and keeps the data like locally to them. It's never shared out with the employer. And then to also take advantage of their position, their sort of bully pulpit as researchers and faculty, to basically say why this architecture needed to be there for this project to be appropriate. So there are other solutions you might have proposed. These are the ones in this case that resulted. Now, the ESR has been around for, I guess we're heading into our third year now. We just a week ago got our 3rd years of worth of grants. We now also are involved in the Stanford's Woods Institute for Sustainability. So we're starting to grow beyond just AI. There are ethical risks in elections research and many other areas as well. About 100 proposals, so much smaller than the one that Deb was describing, because we're just one institution. So we basically all of what are called the Hoffman-Yee grants, these larger grants, and about 1/3 of these smaller sort of 1 year, 1 student style grants iterated with the ESR as a result. So I just want to sort of highlight, what did we learn? What's working? What's not? What can we do better? How do we go about this? We basically surveyed a bunch of people. Trying to survey faculty was a really interesting thing. I was really impressed that we got 2/3 of them to respond. It might have been because I emailed them personally and says, please respond. This is where we take advantage of some social psychological results. We then followed up. Quinn Weiss did a bunch of semi-structured interviews with researchers on these teams, which ranged from engineering, social science, earth science, now the School of Sustainability, excuse me, and medicine. And then we also analyzed what feedback was sent from the panelists. So we did a content analysis of what the panelists did. 14 out of 15 of the panelists consented to having their feedback analyzed. So, okay, here's the first thing that really stunned me. I was basically adding red tape, if you want to view it that way. And every single person who responded wanted to keep it around. I was expecting to get a lot of pushback along the lines of some of the questions that came up in the last talk. But actually, all of my colleagues basically said, yeah, it's, either if you require it, or I would really want to keep doing this, even if you didn't require it, wanted to keep this around. Equally surprising to me was that about 2/3 of those who iterated with the ESR, and about half of all of them, felt that it had actually influenced the design of their research, which is to say it wasn't just some thing where we wrote emails back and forth. It actually changed the research that they did in some appreciable way. And I say that this surprised me because it's, speaking as a faculty member, it's kind of hard to adjust, the kind of research that someone wants to do. The idea is that someone is, in research, you're able to work on mostly what you want to. So they found that this was sufficiently valuable that they actually, wanted to change these things. This was not a heavy-handed or else kind of conversation. So the other thing I think I would take away from this is that it basically indicates the promise of early stage feedback on ethics and society impact. By being way at the beginning of the project, before really much work has been done, it's much, much easier to for small changes to adjust the trajectory of the work. Basically, what we heard was that the main benefit of the process was providing scaffolding. It was a forcing function. It was a commitment mechanism for thinking about these issues, something that they otherwise might not have thought about until they were writing the NERIF's ethics statement much later. So here's a quote from a faculty member in the social sciences who said that, look, this led me to engage with my co-PI because as a psychologist, I wasn't even aware of some of these ethical implications that this AI work might have. And it gave me a reason to engage with my co-PI as part of this requirement. So you have this blank page where you had to write about ethics and societal impact. And he said, okay, well, how are we going to do that? So they started to engage. The scaffolding also helped in that a number of those who we interviewed said that it raised new issues that they hadn't considered. So we were sort of broadening their ethical scope. Here's an example from a faculty member in engineering who said, you know what, we might actually invert our entire project as a result of this conversation to be about privacy. There was a pretty strong concerned reaction, shall I say, from the ESR on one of their projects that made us, maybe what we need to do is lead with the idea of how can we do this in a privacy preserving way. We don't have the answers yet, but it's helped us think about this. Now, what was the main drawback? Not enough scaffolding. This again kind of surprised me. Basically, don't just tell us that we've got to do this, but and it makes sense in retrospect, help us understand what we should do and how much we should be concerned about it. Basically, we kept this ESR statement pretty brief to keep the work from being, really, really burdensome, but people wanted more detail and specificity. Here's an example quote. Basically, this participant wanted what you might think of as the equivalent of an ethical Richter scale. They wanted feedback on their project to say, sort of, how big are these issues? Do you raise these issues? Are these minor things that we should be worried about, or is this a major thing that's going to land us in the New York Times for the wrong reason? So the ESR was not yet in this instantiation helping them make these decisions about the trade-offs. Now, some interesting impacts came out of this. There was a project that the ESR gave feedback on where there were some researchers in AI and I believe chemical engineering looking at trying to find ways to create less toxic chemicals, try to predict the toxicity of a chemical. And the ESR said, if you can predict what makes something a less toxic chemical, you can also use the same technology to figure out how to make things more toxic. And that's kind of dangerous. This wound up, the researchers took this and ran with it, writing an article in Nature Machine Intelligence about sort of the need for this kind of work, which was a pretty cool vision of the kind of impact we had. You may also be familiar in the United States with the creation of the National AI research resource, NARE, we discussed our ESR efforts with them. They're actually recommending going forward that these kinds of ethics reviews processes be required for anyone going through these kinds of national cloud efforts. Now, again, kind of a concern that came up. They wanted to know a little bit more about what we really should be doing, but it's they want to not just have a blank page, is I guess a short version of this. Now, to a certain extent, I think this is inevitable. Like, you have to do some hard thinking here, but I think the more we can scaffold, the better. I won't dwell on this because I think this is going to repeat a number of results that were in the first talk here. The common feedback: harms to subgroups. Have you considered which subgroups within society might be negatively impacted if this were widely adopted? About a third of the grants got feedback on this. Diverse design: do you have all the relevant stakeholders? Dual use: might this be reappropriated? Representativeness: who is and is not in the data? We're currently engaging in some efforts to try to track this stuff over time to see if this is shifting. Are the researchers themselves becoming more socialized to some of these risks, such that the ESR becomes less the group that has to bring it up? So about 80% of proposals, the panelists raised some new issue, which was interesting. Again, this is the 80% of the proposals that iterated with the ESR. So only about a third of the proposals iterated with us. And by iterated, I meant we asked them to iterate. So there are lots of open questions. How would we possibly do this at the scale that Deb was discussing at NeurIPS? We've met with the Dean of Research at Stanford, who wants to say, like, hey, make this bigger. So we need to figure out how to deal with this. My colleague, David Magnus, likes to say that ethics at scale becomes compliance. And he gets very concerned about this. The basic implication of this being that if we benefit a lot by being able to sort of be more conversational and coaching oriented in our work, and if it becomes something that has to like pump through thousands of proposals, we would worry about losing some of that. We're also doing some efforts to try to measure the impact of ESR, in particular on the sort of research cultures at Stanford. We're doing through some randomized surveys as the ESR deploys to different grant programs around campus and so on. So I'll stop here. I want to thank our supporters, NSF and Stanford High in particular, but also the Stanford Ethics Society and Technology Hub and the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. So thanks for your attention, and happy to engage in conversation.